Imagine a sound that simply exists in a state of constant, shimmering motion. It operates like a physical force rippling out across a space. This is the Balinese gamelan. It is an acoustic ensemble constructed of bronze metallophones, thick, resonant hanging gongs, and precisely tuned drums. Listeners are consistently drawn to its metallic timbre. However, the ensemble's structural architecture provides the more significant point of study. This dynamic, interlocking structure differs from the 19th century Western tradition. That system was built around a linear narrative, a single melody driving toward a conclusion, designed for a solitary listener sitting perfectly still. To understand how minimalist music transitioned away from that rigid format, we must look past the surface aesthetic of the gamelan and examine the kinetic mechanics of its rhythm. In a gamelan ensemble, no lone soloist carries the tune. Instead, the melodic responsibility is distributed across multiple performers simultaneously. Executing this requires a specific method of communal play based on interlocking rhythms. The structure relies on two complementary parts. The polos maps out a primary rhythm. The opposing songsi strikes only in the empty gaps. This technique, koteken, merges them, sliding into each other like the teeth of a zipper. At high speeds, these distinct parts blur into a singular, rapid stream of sound. The resulting density exceeds the physical limitations of a single hand. The collective creates an acoustic outcome greater than the sum of its parts. This interlocking mechanism eventually provided a new framework for Western composition. The Western world's introduction to this rhythmic paradigm happened in the late 19th century. At the 1889 Paris World's Fair, an imported gamelan ensemble captivated European audiences. It notably fascinated the French composer Claude Debussy. For decades following that affair, early 20th century composers treated the music as an exotic curiosity. They borrowed its surface-level scales and timbres without fully examining the structural mechanics driving the ensemble. The actual integration required a different approach. In the 1960s and 70s, the technical DNA of the gamelan was extracted and applied to Western tradition. The architects of this integration were the American minimalists. They realized that musical evolution required abandoning superficial annotation. They needed a rigorous study of the interlocking engine itself. In the early 1970s, composer Steve Reich shifted from passive listening to an active structural study of gamelan textures in Seattle and California. He developed a structural framework known as phase shifting. He instructed two musicians to take identical repeating patterns and play them in perfect unison. Then, one player is instructed to gradually speed up. The two identical patterns slowly slide out of sync. This mathematical phasing was a deliberate attempt to apply the logic of Balinese koteken. By shifting the alignment, Reich forced interlocking rhythms to form on their own. As the notes overlapped, new melodies emerged from the acoustic friction. Reich called these resultant patterns, music that was never written down on the page, but generated by the colliding rhythms. To execute this, he utilized metallophones, specifically vibraphones and marimbas, relying on their bright attacks to provide the structural backbone of his major works. Phase logic provided a geometric tool. It allowed Reich to capture the communal virtuosity of Bali and translate it into a Western format. Philip Glass approached this Eastern influence through a different structural lens. Rather than following the Western narrative model of introducing a theme and building toward a resolution, Glass studied the Eastern model of cyclical, nested rhythms. His core mechanism became additive rhythm. He built compositions using steady pulses and modular repetition, starting with a simple foundational rhythmic cell. Instead of writing a new melody, he expands the cell. A 5-beat phrase becomes 6, then 7. The pattern grows outward, building structural momentum through repetition. The inverse process completes the architecture. Once the pattern reaches maximum density, it is systematically contracted, subtracting beats until it returns to its original form. Through additive expansion and contraction, Glass proved that a composer could generate shifting sonic landscapes using the logic of rhythmic math. The success of this cross-cultural exchange rested on the translation of rhythmic logic. By extracting the architecture of the gamelan, composers moved away from the role of the solitary emotional genius and toward a meditative focus on the ensemble. This mechanical precision, built on repeating loops and modular growth, established a lineage that continues through modern electronic production and contemporary film scoring. The relentless pulse driving these modern works finds its structural origin in ancient interlocking bronze architectures from across the world. But this interlocking machinery requires a final structural element, the negative space. In this system, the silences between the notes function as measurable, structural units. These silences act as structural sockets. They provide the physical space required for a complementary pattern to find its home. By adopting this mechanism, the minimalists moved away from 19th century linear development. Through mathematical precision, Western music adopted pure, uninterrupted rhythmic motion. This was brought to you by Notes and Silences. Thank you for listening.